Welcome to our final lecture of the semester as we conclude our examination of the civil rights movement, the classical era of the civil rights movement from the mid-1950s to the mid to late 1960s. In our most recent lecture, we discussed the significant civil rights developments of the 1950s. Today, we will continue with a look at civil rights activism in the 1960s. We will also examine the opposition to the civil rights movement and take a look at the meaningful pieces of legislation that were passed at the federal level to extend civil rights and basic citizenship rights to African Americans and other people who were being discriminated against during this time period in American history. So let us begin by taking a look at some of the significant developments of the civil rights movement in the 1960s from an activism standpoint. Now, I'm not going to go over every single protest, demonstration, boycott activity that occurred in with regard to civil rights activism in the 1960s, because frankly, there were so many of them that it's hard to keep track. I mean, the major ones are prominent and well known, but what made the civil rights movement such an influential movement that spanned multiple decades was the fact that it was very much a grassroots movement. There were organizations and there were leadership at the highest levels of these organizations, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as SCLC. But at its heart, the movement was successful because it inspired a great deal of participation at the grassroots level, particularly among young people, college students, and early to mid 20-somethings, blacks and whites coming together to demonstrate and protest for civil rights advancements. But one of the things that historians have really taken a look at over the last several decades are the numerous examples of local civil rights activities. So you could, for example, take a look at civil rights activities in a specific state or a specific city or a specific county and write an entire book just on the civil rights activity that went on within that local region or municipality, and plenty of historians have done that. And many of those local studies are very valuable pieces of American history, but are less well known compared to the prominent examples that we find in textbooks and throughout most lectures. So I am going to try to hit the highlights here as best as I can. Early in 1960, at the beginning of February 1st, 1960, 4 young African-American men decided to stage a protest of segregation in public facilities through what they called a sit-in. They went to the Woolworth's department store, and Woolworth's was a major department store at that time, sort of similar to Kmart or Kohl's or stores of that ilk today. I don't know if you'd quite say it was like a Walmart, but stores like Kohl's, Kmart, maybe Target, so I guess it was sort of like a Walmart, maybe without the groceries. But Woolworth's was very prominent back in at that time period throughout the South. They went to the Woolworth's department store in downtown Greensboro, North Carolina. These 4 young African-American men, they purchased a few items from the store, and then they went to the lunch counter. Stores had lunch counters back then where customers could come sit down and order some food, sandwich, a burger, that sort of thing, while they were shopping, either before or after they were shopping, or perhaps during a pause in their shopping, that sort of thing. But these lunch counters were segregated. So these 4 young African-American men decided to take seats at the lunch counter, and when they were asked to leave the lunch counter by store employees, they refused to get up. They said, "We're not going to leave until we are served." They were refused service, and they were berated and heckled by customers and employees alike, and eventually arrested. But it sparked the beginning of what was known as the sit-in movement. The men, as I mentioned, were young. They were all college students at North Carolina A&T University, a local HBCU in Greensboro, still operating today, still a very prominent HBCU in the state of North Carolina. And the Woolworths sit-in, as I mentioned, it would spark a trend that would spread throughout the South. And there were sit-ins at other lunch counters, at other department stores in the South, such as Rich's in Atlanta, for example. There were wade-ins at public swimming pools across the South, many of which were segregated. And so African-American activists would come to a whites-only public swimming pool and get in the pool and wade in the pool and refuse to leave. That sort of thing happened with regularity in the South in the wake of the sit-ins. So the sit-in movement, if you will, began in February of 1960 with the 4 young North Carolina A&T college students that simply sat down and refused to leave in the Woolworths department store lunch counter. Student involvement was a key component of the civil rights movement at the grassroots level. The Greensboro sit-in was just one example of a trend in which young African Americans, as well as young white college students, regularly participated in demonstrations and protests to push for civil rights and social change. Just months following the Greensboro sit-in, a new civil rights organization was created known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, referred to by the acronym SNCC, SNCC, pronounced SNCC. It was an interracial group of college students that was formed in 1960, and it began organizing at the grassroots level and from time to time collaborating with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which Martin Luther King was the president of. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, by contrast to SNCC, was full of black clergymen, mostly, King, as well as Ralph David Abernathy and Andrew Young and C.T. Vivian and several others that were key officials in the SCLC, were all black preachers, black ministers, well-educated, many with some kind of advanced degree in theology or divinity or a related field like that. And they were the ones that were leading SCLC, and SCLC was also focused on major cities and trying to integrate public facilities in major cities, whereas SNCC, by contrast, was largely spearheaded by college students and other college-age young people, and oftentimes they worked in smaller towns, rural communities at the grassroots level, really pushing to register people to vote. Voter registration was a big component of what SNCC wanted to do. Ella Baker, a very prominent black woman who was a longtime civil rights activist, she was there at the forefront of SNCC, and she dispatched a man named Bob Moses, a math teacher from Harlem, to Mississippi to begin organizing voting registration drives on behalf of SNCC in Mississippi. Moses arrived in Mississippi in 1961, and he focused on collaborating with black leaders in individual communities throughout small towns across the state of Mississippi. In particular, Macomb, Mississippi was an area in which Moses and SNCC was very active in trying to register people to vote. And that was one of the, as I mentioned, significant differences between SNCC and SCLC. They were focused on the grassroots, local level in small towns and rural areas, and they had younger, less established, if you will, for lack of a better term, organizers working with the community leaders, whereas SCLC often targeted larger cities in the South, places like Birmingham, Memphis, and Atlanta. And as I mentioned, SCLC had an impressive collection of black clergymen that were running the organization at the very top, led by Martin Luther King Jr. An interesting example, a very prominent example of collaboration between the two groups, SCLC and SNCC, occurred in 1965 with the Voting Rights March in Selma, Alabama. It started on March 7th, 1965, when John Lewis, who recently died last summer at the age of 80, he was a congressman from Atlanta, but in 1965 he was the chairman of SNCC. Lewis, along with Hosea Williams of SCLC, led a group of marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, where they were met, attacked, and beaten by Alabama state troopers and local law enforcement. News cameras were there for network television news crews, and the brutality of the attack was visible on evening newscasts across the country. The date was nicknamed Bloody Sunday. Lewis himself suffered a concussion. He was beaten across the skull and nearly died. He did recover from his injuries. But it was a major moment in the civil rights movement, and it was a collaborative effort at the top between SNCC and the SCLC. Another significant event in the early 1960s with regard to civil rights activism at the grassroots level occurred in the spring of 1961. A group of activists sponsored by the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE, decided to put a new Supreme Court decision to the test. The Supreme Court case of Boynton versus Virginia had been decided in December of 1960, and the court ruled in favor of Boynton, outlawing segregation in interstate travel. So this interracial group of activists boarded buses, Greyhound and Trailways buses in Washington, D.C., with the plan of riding the buses from D.C. all the way to New Orleans and challenging the segregation the law that had just been struck down by the Supreme Court, and trying to, in practice, make this journey as passengers to see if they could make it without any interference or any harassment from local officials that would be illegal in violation of the law. At several stops along the way, including Anniston, Alabama, and Birmingham, the Freedom Riders were beaten and harassed by members of the Ku Klux Klan. Many of the Freedom Riders were arrested and jailed in Mississippi, sent to Parchman Penitentiary, the prison farm in Mississippi. In particular, John Lewis and a white Freedom Rider named Jim Zwerg suffered extremely serious beatings in Montgomery, Alabama, when the police protection that was supposed to accompany the Freedom Riders disappeared for a period of about 10 to 15 minutes, allowing the Klan to meet the bus in the station and beat the Freedom Riders violently. And if you take a look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, that is a picture of John Lewis on the left and Jim Zwerg on the right. The two of them, this photo was taken after the two of them sustained the beating in Montgomery, Alabama. You can see the blood on Lewis's dress shirt and sport coat, and similar splotches of blood on the blazer of Jim Zwerg and on the side of his face as well. So very, very serious stuff, very violent stuff that occurred in when the Freedom Riders attempted to make that journey from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans to challenge the norm and the previous law of segregation in interstate travel that had been struck down by the Supreme Court in December of 1960. So, let's take a look at the opposition to the Civil Rights Movement. Who exactly opposed the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s and why? Well, I just mentioned in the discussion of the Freedom Riders that the Ku Klux Klan actively opposed civil rights activists and civil rights demonstrations. Of course, an earlier incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s also terrorized black Americans as well as any non-white, non-Anglo-Saxon Americans during that era. And of course, the first incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan in the years following the Civil War was also essentially a domestic terrorist group. So this third incarnation, if you will, of the Klan in the 1960s is basically carrying out the same type of stuff that their predecessors in previous eras of American history had done with regularity, which is to use violence and domestic terror as a means of trying to intimidate people of color, whether they were African Americans or other non-whites, or even white people who were Jewish or Catholic. The Klan opposed them all. If you were not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the Klan basically opposed you. Local law enforcement officials also frequently attacked civil rights activists. Sometimes they beat civil rights activists, other times they just simply arrested them. But a more sophisticated group that was very active, but generally did not generate the same type of negative headlines, if you will, in the news media, was an organization known as the Citizens Councils. And officially they were white citizens councils. The first white citizens council started in Indianola, Mississippi, just months after the 1954 Supreme Court decision in the Brown versus Board of Education case that struck down segregation in public education across the country. And the Citizens Councils basically consisted of white-collar professionals, business leaders, politicians, doctors, lawyers, the people that, for lack of a better term, were viewed as and considered as the pillars of their respective communities, the community leaders. They weren't going to put a hood over their head and violently attack civil rights activists. Instead, they would meet as a group in their suits and ties and discuss strategy for opposing racial integration in the South, how to prevent it, how to stall it, and what sort of tools they could use to accomplish this goal. The Citizens Councils as a group feared integrated public schools because they saw that as the beginning of an integrated society in the South. Because if you have an integrated public school, that means you have black and white children as classmates together. That means they become friends and involved with each other socially, including potential interracial dating relationships, and ultimately, white people marrying black people and starting interracial or biracial families. And that was a big fear. It was a fear of the Klan during this time. It was a fear of the Citizens Council, this idea that the purity of the white race would disappear, and the result would be what they referred to as a mongrelized race of non-white people. That was a major fear and a major motivator for both the Ku Klux Klan and for the White Citizens Council to spring into action, to do whatever they could to stall, prevent racial integration, resist racial integration. As a whole, these groups and their activity are referred to by historians as the massive resistance movement. So you have the civil rights movement trying for integration and seeking progress, and you have the massive resistance movement looking to counter the civil rights activity and prevent any advancement that would lead to political, social, or economic equality between the races. Individual chapters of the Citizens Council began to spring up all across the South, and the organization used their own media to spread their message. They began publishing a newspaper, producing television and radio programs, and even promotional films to spread their message of white supremacy. One of the more prominent members of the Citizens Council in Mississippi was James Eastland, who was one of the state's 2 U.S. senators, and a very powerful one at that, during the 1950s, 1960s, and most of the 1970s. The group also supported segregationist political candidates at the local and state level, such as Ross Barnett, who won the Mississippi gubernatorial election in 1959, and of course attempted to block James Meredith's enrollment as the first African-American student at the University of Mississippi in the fall of 1962. And you take a look at the image in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. That is the official logo of the Citizens Councils. It says Citizens Councils, and you see the American flag and the Confederate battle flag brought together, and underneath it says states' rights, racial integrity. And that was one of the big arguments that they had. That was the big legal argument, was individual states such as Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia should have the right to set and enforce their own laws regarding the races and regarding segregation. And Jim Crow segregation should stand because this was part of the Mississippi Constitution that had been written by the Redeemer government that we talked about earlier this semester back in the 1890s. And that those laws should take precedence in Mississippi as opposed to federal law. And the federal government had no business in their mind of interfering into the day-to-day activities in Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia or any other of these states in the South or the Deep South at the time. Another group that opposed the civil rights movement, besides the Klan and law enforcement and white citizens councils, were local politicians. I mentioned Ross Barnett, who was supported by the Citizens Council in his run for governor of Mississippi in 1959, and U.S. Senator James Eastland, who was a member, a card-carrying member, if you will, of the Citizens Council for most of his political career. But other local politicians throughout the South during the era of sustained civil rights activity did whatever they could do to preserve Jim Crow laws. Quite simply, the political power structure across the South during this time period and throughout much of the nation as well outside of the South was all white and largely male, and as a result of that, these politicians at the local and state levels were determined to maintain the status quo, and that meant Jim Crow laws in the South, with social segregation and whites sitting atop the political and economic hierarchy in southern cities, southern counties, southern states. Notable Southern governors during this era, such as George Wallace of Alabama, Orville Faubus of Arkansas, Ross Barnett of Mississippi, and Ernest Vandiver of Georgia, all attempted to keep their state's public schools and universities segregated. We mentioned Orville Faubus in the most recent lecture, how he tried to block the enrollment of 9 African-American students at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, back in 1957. George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door on the campus of the University of Alabama, trying to block the enrollment of a couple of black students at the University of Alabama in the early 1960s. He also famously proclaimed that he was for segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Ross Barnett, as I mentioned, and as you're probably well aware, did everything in his power to keep the University of Mississippi all white and to prevent James Meredith from enrolling in the University of Mississippi in the fall of 1962. Ernest Vandiver doesn't get nearly the attention that his counterparts do, primarily because the protesting and the rioting was on a much smaller scale in Georgia, but Vandiver tried to keep both the K-12 public schools and the University of Georgia segregated, and even closed down the schools briefly in the early 1960s before the University of Georgia was officially integrated in the winter of 1961. At the local level, there were other political leaders, such as Eugene Bull Connor, the Public Safety Commissioner in Birmingham, Alabama, who used their office to oppose civil rights activists and civil rights demonstrations. In the case of Bull Connor, he used the police and fire departments that he had authority over against activists who demonstrated in public or sought to integrate public spaces, famously ordering Birmingham firemen to turn their fire hoses on and spray African-American demonstrators in Birmingham from point-blank range. That images of that type of defiance were published in newspapers across America, and as well as national magazines, and the video footage, much like the footage of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, aired on national news telecasts. So this sort of combination of media coverage that frequently depicted civil rights activists and demonstrators as peaceful citizens, and law enforcement and whites as the villains who were violent aggressors, along with court decisions such as Brown v. Board of Education and Boynton v. Virginia. This combination enabled the Jim Crow laws to crumble and spelled the beginning of the end of Jim Crow segregation in the South. So let's take a look now at what that legislation looked like and what exactly that legislation did, how it came to be, etc. We begin in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was a bill that lingered in Congress for months before it was finally passed. The House of Representatives passed it, I believe, in February of 1964 in the winter. It did not pass the Senate until July of 1964, and that was because there was a filibuster from Southern members of the United States Senate that had aligned together to try to prevent the legislation from receiving a floor vote. Eventually, it did receive a floor vote in early July of 1964. The law was passed, or the legislation, I should say, was passed and signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. The Civil Rights Act of 1965 officially outlawed racial segregation in public facilities, including bathrooms, restaurants, theaters, and hotels. It also banned discrimination due to race, gender, ethnicity, and religion and national origin, and specifically banned discrimination in hiring practices due to those factors. So you couldn't deny someone a job because of their race or their gender or their religious beliefs or their national origin, ethnicity, etc. Now, this law, this legislation, had been reluctantly embraced by John F. Kennedy in the summer of 1963 and the fall of 1963. Kennedy was pretty reluctant to tackle the civil rights issue because he knew that there would be tremendous political fallout, that it had the great potential to split the Democratic Party in two, as most of the Southern Democrats opposed any and all civil rights legislation, whereas the Democrats from the Northeast and Midwest and Western states were open to the idea. But in June of 1963, Kennedy addressed the nation about the need for civil rights legislation. And later that summer, after the March on Washington, in which Martin Luther King Jr. delivers his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, Kennedy and his administration begin to try to push for civil rights legislation. Of course, in late November of 1963, Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, and Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, a former Southern senator from Texas, is the guy who skillfully steered the legislation through Congress once he became president in the wake of Kennedy's death. Johnson was a great tactician of Congress. He knew every rule in the Senate inside and out, knew exactly how to count the votes and exactly what sort of techniques to use. So he really pushed hard for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, even though he, like Kennedy before him, recognized the potential political fallout that would occur as a result of this legislation. A year after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, another landmark piece of civil rights legislation is passed into law. That is the Voting Rights Act of 1964, or 1965, I should say, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's important to note that while the Civil Rights Act of 1964 struck down significant social barriers in the South with the ending of segregation in public facilities, African Americans remained blocked by the existing political structure in the South from exercising the most basic right of American citizenship, that being the franchise or the right to vote. And after the initial attempt at the Voting Rights March on Bloody Sunday was thwarted by the public beating of the marchers in Selma, a subsequent march which included Martin Luther King Jr. and his top aides, along with their counterparts from SNCC, took place without significant incident as they marched from Selma to the Alabama state capitol in Montgomery, Alabama. And shortly thereafter, once again, Lyndon Johnson steered legislation through Congress that was passed and became the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Specifically, this law outlawed literacy tests and any other measures used by Southern politicians, including county registrars who would certify the voted registration of citizens and residents. They would use literacy tests. They would use other arcane attempts, measures, I should say, to deny African American citizens the right to vote, such as guessing how many jelly beans are in a large bowl full of jelly beans, that sort of thing. Those were now outlawed as a result of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In addition, the law gave the U.S. Attorney General the ability to send federal officials into the southern states to assist in registering voters. The end result of this legislation was that African Americans could exercise their voting rights in large numbers, and African Americans began to vote in large numbers, and within a couple of decades you began to see quite a few black politicians beginning to win elections in the South in the latter decades of the 20th century. Some examples of that include Maynard Jackson, who was elected mayor of Atlanta, Georgia in 1973. He was later re-elected in 1977, and Atlanta has, ever since electing Jackson in 1973, has elected black mayors consistently ever since then. Andrew Young, an aide to Martin Luther King Jr. in SCLC, was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1972, re-elected in 74 and 76. He also was twice elected mayor of Atlanta in the 80s. And John Lewis, the aforementioned SNCC chair and participant in the Voting Rights March from Selma, he was elected to Congress in 1986 and served in the U.S. House of Representatives until his death last summer at the age of 80. In addition to these examples that I just gave you, there were a number of other black politicians that were elected to local offices throughout the southern states. County commissioners, mayors of smaller cities, state legislatures, etc., etc. But one of the things that it did, in addition to creating a significant increase in political participation for African Americans, was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as well as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, did split the South politically. Many white citizens and politicians began to abandon the Democratic Party, choosing the Republican Party. This didn't really occur in large numbers until the 1970s and 1980s, but the South, which had up to that point had been a one-party region controlled by the Democratic Party, by the 80s and certainly by the 1990s becomes a largely Republican-controlled party due to defections from the mid to late 60s and forward throughout the 70s and the 80s. If you take a look at the image in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, that is on the left, Lyndon Johnson about to shake the hand of Martin Luther King Jr. Following the Johnson's signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. The black man in between King and LBJ, by the way, is a man named Ralph David Abernathy. He was Martin Luther King Jr.'s right-hand man at SCLC, his top aide, and he eventually became King's successor as president of SCLC and a very prominent civil rights activist in his own right. So that is Abernathy in between King and Lyndon Johnson. So these landmark pieces of legislation pass in the mid-1960s and are signed into law in 1964 and 1965. So where does that leave civil rights activism, the civil rights movement, post-1965? The movement shifts as legal segregation in the South has effectively ended. The new goal is for an expansion in economic opportunity, which remained elusive for African Americans at this time. After the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. shifted his focus toward ending poverty. That became King's primary goal in the last 3 years of his life. He fought for affordable housing, a higher minimum wage, and guaranteed employment for all Americans. And he tried to reach out not only to African Americans, but also Hispanics, Latinos, Native Americans, immigrants, even poor white Americans. In King's public speeches in 1966 and 1967 and early 1968, he frequently pointed out the massive gap in income and wealth between white Americans and their black counterparts. And at the time of King's assassination in April 1968, he was in the process of planning a second March on Washington 5 years after the 1963 March on Washington. This was going to be known as the Poor People's Campaign, and it was designed to spotlight the plight of poverty in America and force Congress and the Johnson administration to address that issue. Abernathy and other aides of King carried out that campaign and continued to fight for his ideals, but they did not have anywhere near the same degree of success that the movement had in terms of getting the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and because of that, that's a significant reason why some of these issues are still prevalent in America today. There is still a major income gap and wealth gap between white Americans and African Americans. Affordable housing is something that eludes many Americans across the country, but in particular, black Americans have fallen victim to this. These are still issues that have not been sufficiently resolved the way that King and that many of his aides, as well as other civil rights activists of the 1960s, would have envisioned and would have hoped for all these years later. It's also important to note that in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a key portion of the Voting Rights Act in the case of Shelby County versus Holder, and as a result of that Supreme Court decision, many states throughout the South began to very quickly pass voter ID laws. And so that's at the heart of what is in the news lately in the wake of this contested 2020 election. And going forward, this idea of voting rights and voter suppression and things like that that our current contemporary politicians are debating day in and day out. It's because the portion of the Voting Rights Act that required federal oversight of elections in the states in the South where Jim Crow segregation was prevalent, that was struck down in that 2013 Supreme Court decision, and there has not been a subsequent Voting Rights Act or legislation to amend that in any way, shape, or form. So that is why voting rights remain a very big hot-button issue in American politics today. There are a lot of people across the country that believe that their right to vote is being challenged or being suppressed, and particularly people of color and people in low-income communities. Whereas on the other side, a lot of white Americans, particularly those in middle-class and affluent communities, believe that voter suppression is a myth. And I'm not here to tell you one way or the other. I'm not trying to tell you what to believe or anything like that, but I'm telling you that those are the feelings of the two groups, and they are, both sides are very entrenched in what they believe. But if that Supreme Court decision had not struck down that portion of the Voting Rights Act, then I don't think we would see the rash of these laws being challenged or laws, legislation that's working their way through state legislatures across the country. So that's where I'm going to leave things for this lecture and for this course for this semester. Don't forget that your final exam is due on Thursday, April 29th by 6 p.m. Central Time. That's the deadline to submit it to SafeAssign. I wish you the very best of luck on the exam for this course, as well as the final exams and assignments for your other courses. I hope you've had a great semester overall under challenging circumstances as we continue to try to complete an academic year in the midst of a global pandemic.